Hello from ABA Midyear Meeting 2018 in Vancouver, Canada. I'm Laurence Colletti.
Kyle McEntee.
Rachel Van Cleave.
CJ Ryan.
And we're on the road with Legal Talk Network. And we're back. It's our last interview for today's coverage, continuing coverage, but we're going to be talking a lot about what's going on at law schools today. I have the presenters and a guest who was sitting in the presentation today. The name of the presentation, this session was called The Perennial and Stubborn Challenge of Cost, Affordability, and Access in Legal Education. Has it finally hit the fan? So let me do a brief round of introductions here in terms of bio. So Kyle, let's start with you. Where do you work? What do you do?
Sure. I'm the executive director of Law School Transparency. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we are engaged in legal education policy.
So how'd you end up in the session? I understand there was Joe Patrice from Above the Law talked with you and directed you. Hey, you may want to check that out.
He did. That was Joe's doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. That's a little shout out for one of our hosts there. He hosts a show called Thinking Like a Lawyer. Obviously, Joe works for Above the Law, one of our favorites. All of our hosts are our favorites, just so you know, in case anybody was wondering. All right, Rachel, how about yourself? Where do you work? What do you do?
So I'm a professor at Golden Gate University School of Law and most recently served as dean of the law school for 5 years.
Is that California, Golden Gate?
San Francisco.
San Francisco. Excellent. I'm from Southern California. So hello from
Sorry.
San Diego. I don't know if I feel sorry that I'm in San Diego, but that's all right. That's all right. All right, CJ, how about yourself?
I am a doctoral fellow at the American Bar Foundation and a Ph.D. candidate at Vanderbilt University.
Okay, great. So we've got a lot of questions here, but I think we should start with probably one of the most looming, and I'm using the word looming on purpose. Let's talk about debt. Who wants to open up? Everyone's reluctant. I can't imagine
obviously,
why.
I mean, certainly it's a huge problem. Law school tuition has been going up, although I think there's been more attempts recently to come up with alternatives, not a lot yet, and keep it down. But it comes from one issue is related to admissions. I mean, it's hard to pull apart any one of these topics where law school applications to law school dropped dramatically after 2010, after a big spike in applications, and that has an impact on law schools, and they're trying to figure it out, how to get students, but also how to have tuition revenue, how to make sure that the graduates aren't graduating with too much debt that can be addressed with their employment after law school.
You know, I wonder if the actual cost of education has gone up, because now my observation, and granted, I'm not an expert, I haven't seen all of the data underlying this, but my observations, talking to some of my friends that came out years later, is that despite a recession, and despite job opportunities kind of going south, especially during the recession, the march north of tuition rates continued to climb. And so I can't imagine that the rate of the cost it takes to educate people went up as much as the tuition rates were going up. So I wonder what Kyle might think about that.
Sure. When you look at the cost of legal education, you're looking at an aggregation of choices made by a variety of stakeholders, whether they are at the university level and the provost and what they dictate to the dean as to what the priorities should be. And then you have choices made by the faculty about, and the dean as well, about how to allocate the limited financial resources that they have. And so, I think that's important to keep in mind of the limited power of any individual actor within a school. And you end up with kind of a creep in the cost because maybe not all the hands are talking to each other or mouths are talking to each other. And I think that likely contributes to the problem, although I'd be curious to hear Rachel's perspective on that as a former dean of a law school.
Yeah, so actually setting tuition and working on the budget is a collaborative effort at Golden Gate, and working with the university and the CFO and really talking through a lot of issues about, one concern for me while I was dean was, while I recognized that some modest increases might be necessary, I very much wanted to keep it as low as possible. And that, again, worked into other areas. How do we start to reduce our costs? And that resulted in a lot of collaboration, again, with the university in what are some of the services that we're providing students, maybe either back offices or library services or other types of services that we can collaborate and combine with the university to reduce costs overall. Because for just the law school to reduce our costs doesn't necessarily address overhead that the university might have. So how can we reduce costs together overall?
Well, I've got a background in business, and one of the things, the two primary drivers of overhead, first and foremost, the most expensive are your employees, generally speaking. And then the next is your physical plant.
Physical plant.
And so those are the two big ones. And so I just, in terms of that, as dean, obviously you're looking at the expense sheets. What are the big drivers within those two units that I think commonplace amongst many law school institutions? What's driving it these last 10, 15 years?
Mm-hmm. So what I was focused on was, as we were becoming a smaller law school in terms of numbers of students, we need to become a smaller law school. We need to scale that, right? So that really involved talking to faculty about this is what the job is now. Might not have been the same as when you started 20 or 30 years ago, but this is what it's now. And, having some very direct and candid conversations about that. And that led some people to opt for some modest incentives and to retire. And, in terms of the physical plant, some of the details there, I didn't always know from the CFO, but a lot of fixed costs involved in that. But we did move out of one of the two university buildings so that we could then rent it out as a way to reduce costs and bring in some income.
I think one thing that's worth pointing out is that unlike a traditional business, a law school's human capital is largely tenured. And so it's much more difficult to remove them. So that's why you need those incentives, because unless you can declare financial exigency or you close the school down, they're very difficult to get rid of. And that makes it very challenging for law schools to cut the cost of legal education.
Well, before we bring CJ into it, because I feel bad, he's hanging out there all by himself. I just wanted a little follow-up with the dean. So just, within your circle of deans and some of the other educators, is there talk about review of the tenure process? Because, in business, you don't have enough coming in the door. You have to make layoffs. And I understand that's more difficult when you're talking about professors. But, it's law schools, like many things, it's a business as well. There's a business component of it. Are law schools beginning to re-examine the tenured proposition for everyone? So
certainly that was an issue that came up even with the ABA in terms of ABA standards and security position. As I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of law school faculty not happy to open up that discussion. And I think, I don't have all of the data, but anecdotally, I think that it's looking very carefully at every position. And what do we need to get out of that position? Is this something that justifies a tenure track position? Should this be a long-term contract? Should this be a short-term contract? Really examining any position that we hire for when we are in a position to hire. What do we need to get out of it, and what's the best match in terms of what type of position it should be?
Moreover, I believe that a driver of the cost has been the fact that many of these law schools that we're talking about are affiliated with parent institutions, universities. And these universities, a significant number of them are state universities. Well, state universities' budgets have declined because of the reality that state legislatures' appropriations have declined over the same period of time. It has a domino effect.
I realize it's a tough question to answer. There's probably not one perfect solution for any one university, but this question is for anybody. I still see the rates for tuition rates climbing up, and even with schools that have quite an endowment, the tuition rates continue to increase. And I know financially, eventually going to hit a point, the salaries aren't growing to that same degree. You're going to hit the wall, and return on investment for education is going to drop, and it'll be a precipitous decline of new law school applicants. And so, are we there? Are we at that point?
Let me provide some statistical context here that I think might be valuable. So we can look at net sticker tuition and see that has gone up every year on average since probably forever, right? Even in recent times where schools are under pressure to enroll people, they've by and large not cut their sticker price, but they are cutting their average price paid or their net tuition. And we've seen the net tuition drop by about 1% or 2% each year for the last few years. And so that's an important factor to consider when analyzing the cost of legal education, that it is to some extent coming down, but it's a question of who is it coming down for? Because the percentage borrowing has actually declined in recent years despite the cost being so high, which begs the question as to who are we enrolling? And it seems that we might be enrolling a wealthier cohort of individuals, which is not good for a profession like ours.
Any follow-ups on that?
Well, at present, the data do show, I believe, what Kyle is saying, at least in the descriptive sense, about the reality of an increasing raw dollar amount of the sticker price, but in fact, a greater discount rate to students. However, it's very difficult from the data that is available, that's publicly available, to analyze the question that Kyle brings up on the back end of that, and that is, for whom is it declining? The ABA aggregates this data at the institution level, so that student level response that would answer this very question is not something that we can get from the data available.
So I wonder if there's some technology solutions in here that can play a part. Technology in the early days of the industrialization, the per unit cost of labor went down because you had machines doing the work. And today we deploy our computers to do a lot of our analytical, or not our analytical, but some of our calculation work, run factories, automate. You see the advent of artificial intelligence being plugged into many of the services that we use today. And I'm just wondering, this is a question for everybody, how can that possibly play a role in bringing down these costs, maybe to a point where you really start to see a meaningful drop in the cost of tuition?
So you mean in terms of like online education, or using technology for the education piece, or for the actual providing legal representation?
There's great communication mediums out there. People, instead of flying, they use Skype or they use Google Hangouts. There's like Zoom, big conference. I've seen kind of an advent of online education as well. My sister did a remote MBA where she did that completely away from a campus. So there you go. You remove the plant aspect of it. Mm-hmm. Those online components are very scalable. So you actually, you could see a decrease in personnel as well. The two primary driving costs of just about any business. So I'm just wondering if there's been some discussions within the academic setting to deploy some of those technologies to do exactly that.
So I think there's been lots of discussion about online education. And as you know, the ABA has some credit hour limits and how much can be provided. And I think there's a lot of discussion about how effective it can be. Certainly, my understanding of it is it certainly would require a high level of discipline, individual discipline, to stay on top of something that, you just at home in your PJs, flip open your laptop. And, from the perspective of a faculty member, maybe you could have more students because they're all over the place, the country, the world. But I think some of the things that faculty members do in terms of assessment and grading, and certainly there's a lot more focus on assessment of student learning. Grading 50 papers versus grading 100 papers is more work.
And that rolls into the question of why it's hitting the fan now, which is law schools were enrolling and continue to enroll too many students. And it might be an option for one school to expand their access to online education and increase their enrollment, but are there jobs at the end of the tunnel? And if legal education continues to cost as much as it does, that's a big problem. Now, if we can get the cost down to $3,000 or $4,000 per year for everyone, then I'm completely okay with enrolling as many people as you want and just doing it for the edification.
So where are you concluding that law schools are enrolling too many people? What's your point?
Sure.
For that?
So over the last 25 years, there have been between 27 and 30,000 full-time legal jobs on the entry-level market. And that number has stayed pretty steady, but it has actually been declining every year since 2013 to below 24,000. And last year, law schools enrolled just over 37,000 people. And they will lose some of those through forced attrition, voluntary attrition, but not enough to make up for that percentage. And so there are still substantially more people going to law school than there will be a legal job at the end of the tunnel.
And what's your definition of a legal job? Because
I would say,
as I'm sure you know, not everybody goes into a large law firm.
Sure. I would not use the category of large law firm as that determinant. Mm-hmm. The figures I just cited are full-time legal jobs, meaning a job that requires a law license.
And you're getting that from where?
That is a combination of NALP data going back to 1985 and more recently ABA data.
And in fact, the ABA data does include a category for JD Advantage jobs. So if we expand the category there would be enough, in my view, of a market for recent law grads to have an avenue to employability where they're using their JD.
Somewhat, I think that's true, but Now data tell us that people who are in JD Advantage jobs are 3 times more likely to be searching for another job despite having that job. And that's at 10 months out after graduation. I think it's 42% of all people in JD Advantage jobs are still seeking a job, whereas it's, I think, 11 or 12% last year. And to me, that's a pretty striking piece of data, right? It tells us that those are not the jobs that those people want, right? Now, into the future, over the next 10, 20 years, are we going to see the profession change even more? Absolutely. Are the nature of the jobs people will have in and around the profession going to change? Yes, but we're not there yet. And a lot of those jobs are not great jobs, and I think the data bears that out.
Why don't we change the subject to something more happy like bar passage?
Yeah.
So I've noticed that some of the pass rates for some of the different bars have declined, and obviously people are getting concerned because legal education hasn't changed that much in this period of time, and yet students are having a hard time upon graduation passing that bar. And of course, that is a major block to getting a job. Nobody wants to hire you as a lawyer if you can't be licensed in your state. So I just wanted to open this up. What are the contributing factors to a relative decline in the bar passage rates across the country?
So I think that there are so many factors that go into it. And, one narrative that some people would like us to believe is that our students just aren't as good as they were. I don't believe that. And of course, when we're looking at bar pass, and obviously we want our graduates to pass the bar on the first time, California, I've known many people throughout my career who haven't passed the California bar exam on the first time. But that's the data point that we all use. I think that there are multiple factors.
It's absolutely a multifactorial issue. And,
Sure.
and there's no single input that is determinative of why bar passage rates have exhibited the trends they have over, let's say, the last 10 years. But the reality is bar passage is not something that is necessarily influenced by law schools. It's often controlled by state bar examiners. And so any changes to this problem, to address this problem, have to include the profession and the state bar examiners.
I think there's a big divide over what's taught in school versus what's tested on the bar, and another divide into actually what you do in practice. And I just think the disconnect, for example, Colorado is one of the states where you had two fact patterns. They've changed this, but 2 fact patterns on the exam. You had an MBA fact pattern, so it was kind of the same fact pattern that everybody was seeing on the multi-state bar examination day. They also had a Colorado-specific fact pattern. So now you have to learn 2 different fact patterns for the same area of law. So you have 2 different standards for criminal law. Now why do you have to learn 2? One applies in Colorado and one does not. And so now you have to learn this fake bar pattern, this fake fact pattern that you're never going to apply. You have to memorize it and regurgitate it under, excruciatingly short timelines. And then you're going to do all that, but that's not really what practice is about either. So you get out from that bar exam, if you pass it, and your practice life looks a lot different. So I don't know, I kind of turn back. My dad's a orthodontist who went to dental school and went to orthodontic. My mom's a nurse. These are very practical professions. They teach you how to practice and teach you your trade while you're in school. And I do feel like sometimes the law school aspect of it kind of misses that practice component of it. I know schools are trying to get at that from some clinics. Those are just some of my thoughts, and I just wanted to kind of hand that around for a group discussion.
Well, I think legal education has never been better, and I don't think it's even close. I graduated in 2011, and I think the legal education I would receive today is vastly different than the one I received. And so I think schools are making monumental efforts on this front, and that most of the profession is just behind the times on the quality of legal education. And I don't think it's at all related to the bar exam, bar passage rates. As Rachel was referring to, there are people who believe that it does have to do with the quality of students that are being admitted. And I am one of the principal advocates of that worldview. It's not to say that the LSAT in particular is the end-all be-all, but it is the best predictive tool we have before law school as to someone's likelihood of completing school or passing the bar exam. And we've seen these indicators drop. We've seen GPAs not mitigate those lower LSATs. And accordingly, we've seen bar passage rates plummet. And I do think it has to do with the choices law schools are making in the face of financial pressure. They're saying we are tuition driven. We need those bodies. And as a result, we're going to start taking more chances.
I think California's a good example that there's a lot of schools that are non-ABA accredited that they're training students to take the bar exam.
But their bar passage rates are almost never above 30%.
But how does that compare to the ones that went to ABA accredited schools walking into an exam that they're not as prepared for? They haven't had as much time to prepare for. Are they doing better than the ABA accredited schools for that, or
No, they're not. No.
Kyle, you were saying, there's been more admittance of students into law school, and so, more students are going to get what you get, I guess. There's going to be some people that flock to the law. They're very talented at it. I don't think I was necessarily a very gifted student. I had friends that they had these unbelievable memories, could remember everything, did fantastic in school, doing a whole lot less work than I was doing. And so I'm just kind of wondering, is part of that just with the larger body of students, maybe the people that are naturally gifted, there's less of them. And so you take that whole body and you have kind of less of the naturally gifted people in that mix, and that's bringing down the overall score. Is there part of that maybe going on, or with greater numbers?
I think it's really hard to say, especially for let's say the top 25 law schools, that the quality of the students that they're admitting has declined. I think on average we see maybe a trend emerging there, but I think it's really hard to paint the whole population of law schools with such a broad brush, because
Sure.
the reality is what is happening at a state public flagship may not be happening at a private elite, may not be happening at a public regional. And so it's very difficult to speak in sort of broad strokes about these trends.
And the reason I asked that is because, during the recession, obviously the desire to go to law school was down. You had admissions going down. So what I heard was a lot of schools were kind of lowering their admission scores. And so now you're beginning to attract people that maybe could not have gotten in before, maybe, and it has nothing to do with raw intelligence of the individual, just how do you respond to these standardized tests? And so now you've got people that may not respond to a standardized test coming through the law school. And I'm wondering, is that kind of back to your point there, CJ?
Yeah, well, Barry Currier referenced this in our panel, that very often admissions is driven by a grid. It's driven by GPA and LSAT with almost equal weight. So I don't know that that grid has really shifted over time. If you look at even the schools that operate on that grid, I don't know that it's really changed that drastically over time.
And I would just want to point out that even though perhaps the LSAT is the best indicator, actually, before somebody goes to law school, I think what's even a little bit strong, it's not that great, first of all.
It is statistically significant, though.
It's still not that great. And it's only intended to predict first-year performance. But even so, I'm not sure. I mean, it's one thing to look at the aggregate numbers, but when we've looked at our students at Golden Gate, and we look at numbers of pretty darn close, if not exactly the same numbers of admitted students, GPA and LSAT, and if we had taken them out, our bar pass rate, the percentage, would not have changed, because half of them passed the bar on the first time and half of them did not. When we go back to look and see, was there anything in their file that would have helped us figure out who were those who were going to pass on the first time and who were not? Not really. So I think on the one hand, there is something in the aggregate numbers, but it also misses what individuals may or may not be capable of in spite of perhaps lower numbers.
Well, so can I ask you a question then, based on your particular experience at the school? So in 2012, the bar passage rate at Golden Gate was 68% first time. And in 2015, it was under 40%, I think 39.6%. Mm-hmm. So if it's not the lower credentials that explain that, and the California did not change their cut score or their exam in that period of time, what is it that explains such a dramatic drop if it's not the entering credentials?
So I think that there are lots of, at Golden Gate, we had recently reformed the curriculum, and when you make changes to the curriculum, sometimes it takes a while to work out the kinks. We added more credits to legal research and writing. We added experiential learning in the first year. We added experiential learning requirements before the ABA did. So we made pretty significant changes which meant we took out some credits for certain courses in the first year, moved them into upper division. So I think in part it's what happens in working through those changes and figuring out how you need to make adjustments along the way. So for us, I think that perhaps it was particular to what was going on. There's also some things that were going on with actual preparing for the bar, where there was more online opportunity. And some of that meant that students could sit at home and watch the same thing that they would have watched if they'd gone into a classroom, and could speed it up, or had to just be super disciplined. And so while online seems very attractive, what we've seen is that not all of our students are prepared to make the most of that experience. We're working on that. We partnered with a different bar review company that breaks up the online and actually asks them questions over the course of it to kind of keep them engaged, and also how we talk to students about preparing for the exam. And you're right, first time went down, but those students catch up.
So, Rachel, as an educator, I was always curious about this. I don't know data one way or the other on this. How involved are law schools with the bar examiners in any given state?
I think it varies a lot from state to state, where in some states, like in New York, when they make changes, the Chief Justice calls all the law school deans together and they talk about it. That's not what happened in California, at least with some of the more recent changes, going from a 3-day to a 2-day and talking about changing the cut score. It varies dramatically, I think, from state to state.
I'm not unique to complain about this, but I'm going to complain. The hardest part for me was the time factor, the time crunch. So I felt like, especially with the MBE, and I'm just not a terribly quick reader, and that was a big struggle for me. I felt like I was gearing up to read something and regurgitate it super fast as opposed to being tested on what I actually knew. But when you get me in an essay environment, I'm being tested on what I know. And I feel like lawyers, I think the value add is, like, do they have the requisite knowledge to practice law, not how fast they are. In fact, I think most model rules around the country say, hey, you got to budget your time. You can't overload your schedule. You're not supposed to be rushing from here to there. You're supposed to plan your day accordingly. And that's what the model rules expect. That's what, the ethical rules in each state expect. And so I'm just kicking that back to you, Rachel, as an educator. You guys come up with tests to try to measure the relevant requisite knowledge for each of the courses, for each of the subjects. How do you think that plays out with the bar exam just around the country as it's given generally?
On the one hand, we want to do things in law school that will help our graduates prepare for the bar exam. On the other hand, we have a lot more to do than prepare them for the bar exam. So we actually ask faculty to have at least one of their essays be modeled on that, on what a typical bar exam essay. I often use them in class just to review the material and say, this was on the California bar last summer. How would you start? What would you do? And I think that I dreaded the multiple choice part of the exam. And I committed to doing 15 every morning all summer long with my brilliant roommate who never seemed to study.
There's always one of those.
And by that amount of familiarity and review, it wasn't that I learned more about subject matters necessarily, but I could see patterns. You start to see patterns in how they ask questions, how they frame answer choices. And so, I think those are the types of things trying to communicate with students is looking for these patterns. And this isn't necessarily what being a lawyer is, but right now this is the requirement. So control what you can control, and that's how you prepare for it. And don't worry about the rest of the noise right now.
Terrific. So I want to get CJ's thoughts and I want to get Kyle's thoughts. We're a little short on time, so I just want you guys to follow up on what Rachel said there. And then I'd like to give you an opportunity just to kind of have final thoughts before we close it out. So CJ, let's start with you.
So I would add to that the timed environment on the bar exam is artificial. In the real world, you would have, not unlimited, but some greater amount of time to address your client's concerns. However, it prepares you, in a sense, for having to work on a fixed time frame. We all work on deadlines. We all have to sort of abide by constraints. And so while imperfect, there is value in there, just as the Socratic method has value. I believe that trains you for colloquy with a judge. It seems sort of daunting to the 1L, but there's something that comes out of it that's worthwhile.
I'm going to fire right back at you, CJ. In terms of analyzing the qualifications of someone to practice law in a given state, is that speed, that kind of compression of time, a necessary standard for everybody to achieve that's going to be a successful, competent attorney?
Well, it's hard to take up that mantle as the sort of end-all and be-all of what it means to be a lawyer, that you can do something in a timed frame. But the reality is that every standardized test, as a test of a measure of someone's competency, is done in a timed environment. I can't think of another. I really can't think of any other area that doesn't do this. So it's very difficult to conceive of a way in which a bar exam could measure that over a course of 2 days without being in time.
You could drop the amount of questions. What's it, 100? Maybe you could go to 75 and give people a little more time.
Yeah, sure.
I know I'm being a pill. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to. I'm trying to flesh out these issues. Also, I'm trying to have a little fun at the end of the day too. So let's get Kyle's opinions.
Yeah, well, I think there's three kind of issues that we've talked about that are getting conflated a bit. So we've got, on the one hand, we've got the falling bar passage rates, right? And what that has to do with whether it's self-inflicted by schools, whether it's changes by the bar exam administrators, or if it's falling credentials, whatever that is, that's a problem that we need to address as a profession when legal education costs as much as it does. On top of that, we have cut scores that are too high in some states. California is the best example. It is completely unreasonable where the cut score is set currently. That said, as you said earlier, it is essential to pass the bar exam to practice law. And so we have to use the golf analogy, play it as it lies. And all of that is not to say that the exam is the right exam, which is just a separate question, and making sure that it's validated for the purposes of what it actually means to practice law in a competent fashion and an ethical fashion. That's a completely different set of questions, and I don't think related to what's problematic in terms of why things are hitting the fan. That said, it's still an important goal to fix the bar exam, to make it so it's a better guard to the profession, so it actually is doing its consumer protection function.
All right, final thoughts. I'm going to turn it back to CJ. I actually want to give Rachel the last final word on the podcast today. So let's start with CJ. Just final words based on what we discussed today.
Well, legal education is confronting realities that, frankly, it hasn't never faced in any other time. And I believe it's doing so in ways that are inventive and are ways that are going to move forward the profession into the 21st century. We previewed in our panel today several of the natural experiments that are taking place. And as Kyle said earlier, legal education really is in fine form as it stands today. And I look forward to joining the Academy and being a part of it in years to come.
Kyle.
So the legal profession is essential to a functioning democracy. And when legal education is weak, it threatens the profession, which threatens the rule of law. So I think it's incumbent that we solve these problems as quickly as possible. And that means creating a pipeline from before law school through the end of the profession that actually can reflect what our society looks like from a diversity perspective, because we do a terrible job with that as a profession. But it also means being able to attract people who can afford and want to attend. And it fundamentally comes down to the cost of education. And until we get that under control, we're going to still have all these problems to deal with.
And Rachel.
So I would like to just add one piece before I sum up, and that is many students coming to law school are coming with undergrad debt. And it's not as if we're the only institution of higher education that hasn't figured out how to minimize
That is true.
tuition. So let's put it in the broader context. What I would like to add is I agree that we need to all be working together. I feel like a lot of what has happened, especially with the initial decline in enrollment and the Great Recession, was a whole lot of finger pointing. Different institutions, the profession, a lot of law schools, a lot of finger pointing. And I think we're starting to move past that. I'm not sure we're completely past it, but I think until we start to come together and really think about what are the creative solutions, I completely agree that it is critical to our democratic society. Lawyers are builders. They're the ones that we rely on. And whether they're working in a corporate law firm or working as a public defender or working in the legislature drafting laws, lawyers are builders. And so the more we can work together and try to figure this out, I think the better. And I remain committed to the experience of our students. I mean, that was my key mantra during my tenure as dean, was how are we supporting our students? How can we do better? And this is the job now. These are the students now. So what do we need to do?
I want to say thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, especially at the end of the day. Really interesting, really enlightening, learned a lot. And, I think it's a lot of different perspectives, I agree with you, Rachel. I think we get a lot of different heads in there. Eventually, I think we'll start getting the results that we desire. So just want to close it out with some contact information. I think we'll go back to CJ. If our listeners want to follow up, how can they reach you?
They can reach me at cryan@abfn.org.
All right, and Kyle.
You can reach me at kyle@lawschooltransparency.com.
And Rachel.
rvancleave@ggu.edu.
All right. Well, we've reached the end of the road for this episode, but I want to thank our guests for joining us and also our listeners for tuning in. And if you like what you heard today, please rate us an Apple Podcast. See you next time for another episode of On the Road with Legal Talk Network.
If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, please visit LegalTalkNetwork.com. Subscribe via iTunes and RSS. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, or download our free Legal Talk Network app in Google Play and iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.